excited about. But this is a very relevant topic for things that have happened in neuroimaging over the last few years. And anyone who read headlines back in 2015, 2016 probably heard a little bit about this. So, let's talk about it. So, the issue is multiple comparisons, and we'll talk about some ways that's handled, some issues with it, and then sort of just generally dealing with such things in life, just because, time for sort of introspection of some sort. So, multiple comparisons. Unlike if you do a BDA on like 50 people and you look to see if two groups are different on one value, imaging gives you more values, which is good, makes it fun, but it has a downside in that you run into a multiple comparison problem. So if you think about like old days of data, when you had single band, you would have something like 800, you would have like an 8-minute scan. And in a 64 by 64 grid with 30 slices every 2 seconds, you'd end up with like 31 million data points. These aren't all orthogonal, but they're all data points. And with resting state, HCP, tighter grid, faster time sequence, more data collection, more data. And this also carries up onto the group level. When you start thinking about multiple subjects in multiple groups, you want to get published, you want at least 25, and you think about the size of the beta weight matrix, and you're looking at that, those sort of multi-million numbers of values going into it. You're looking at just on the grid level, 100,000 or so in the coordinate system. So there's lots of data going on is the main message here. And this is inflated because you're going to mask data, and having more subjects is actually a good thing. Having more data points is a good thing into your power. But you're still going to have to work with large quantities of data and sort of doing Bonferroni corrections with the amount of data you've got or the amount of contrast you're making. You get down to ridiculous numbers. So I'll talk a little bit more about, so Bonferroni, the concept of Bonferroni is if you have one piece of, if you are comparing people on their BDI scores, but then you also go, wait, I also want to look at differences in heights between these two groups, and I want to see differences in zip codes between these groups. And you can come up with some sort of ones that may be somewhat orthogonal, may not be orthogonal, but each time you retest another idea in a totally new area, your chance of just getting a false positive increases by the number of tests you do. So the way you control for that is if you had 20 random number generating variables and you tested each of those, and you thresholded it at a 0.05 level, one of those is going to come out significant on average, on median. So the Bonferroni correction is divide by the number of tests. This doesn't quite work out so easily well for a data set where you have 100,000 voxels that you're looking at. So you need to make controls for that. You need to say, okay, there's aspects of my data that may make this hard threshold unachievable. One form of correction is an FDR correction. I won't get too much into it, but the basic idea is that, let's say that you had, let's say that you had 5 tests you were doing. The first one you would correct with a Bonferroni correction, and you'd need to go above 0.01. The next one, you'd divide by 4, and you'd only need to meet the 0.0125 level. Next one by 3, 1, 2, 6, 7. You guys can do the division thing, or I can, but we don't need to. So each time, and then the lowest level that you pass that threshold, everything above that is significant. So that's one way of, if you really do have a lot of significance in your data, it comes out. But you're still expecting some level of orthogonality of your data, which isn't sort of a situation that we're at with the imaging data. So the image data isn't just completely random, it's just not a random scattering of data. So spatially adjacent areas have similar signal. This can be, some of it is due to data collection, some of it, so when Tom went over the data collection and you have your gradient and your phase and all of that, and there's where your centroid of your voxel of collection is going to have certain properties, but the ones adjacent will have some of the similar properties just in the kind of signal that they're sending and receiving. But also the internal structure of what you're dealing with has some strong similarities, and you're going to need to account for those as well. So both your noise and your signal are going to have spatial correlations. So you need to account for it in what you expect to see. You wouldn't expect to see, if you had large blobs of significance and the voxels were nowhere near each other, that's probably not blood flow. But also, noise won't be kind and distribute evenly across your data. So you need to account for both when you do this. So one of the approaches, I'm going to talk about sort of a number of different approaches. One is random field theory. So if in random field theory, you set a p-value, and say for this data it's say 0.275, and you have a certain size of your matrix, and you set your p-value, and you look to see how many blobs of data. So what's they talk about terms of the resels, the Euler characteristics, or EC, and then your determined P. So the resels is basically how many pieces of information are going into your data. What's your matrix size? What's your resolution element? Then the next part is Euler characteristics. If you set a p-value right there at 0.05, which is at 3.75, how many blobs will you come up with? How many different expressions of your data will you get? And that's your Euler characteristics. Now you start going, okay, your average blobs that you're getting in a given set of data should only be, the above a 0.05 level. So you shift your p-value so that your Euler characteristics of your noise data is not giving you a much higher rate of output than is reasonable. Similar thing is done in, I'm going to use the AlphaSim table. AlphaSim has now been replaced with ClusterSim. So this is one of the only times you actually see what comes out of AlphaSim, but it's helpful in thinking about how this data is created. Here, a noise file was created based on the noise in the existing data, and that is then run and rerun and rerun, and clusters come out. And you look to see if you threshold that value at 0.05, say, and you can change your threshold value at the voxel level, then this one is actually threshold at 0.001. So if you threshold your voxel level, how many times do you get a cluster of a certain size in your data if you do 10,000 permutations? So what you do is you walk up your sizes. How big a size do you get so that your noise is only creating a voxel of that size 1 in 20 times that you run your permutations, your Monte Carlo. So by basically producing fake data, looking to see how big your cluster gets, and then produce it again. Look to see how big your cluster gets. Produce again. Look how to see. Eventually, with this fake data set that they produced, the cluster size of 18 only came up in 1 in 20 simulations. So now you're doing a cluster correction. And it's based on your underlying data. And everybody went, okay, good. We're done here. We've got a method. It's not actually the case, as you can probably guess or have read in articles. But, you know, that was the hypothesis. So I'm going to try out giving you guys in-class quizzes. So let me know if this works. I've never tried it before. I don't know what it's like for you guys on that side. So just give me a shout. I just published one quiz, which is which of these are the most stringent approaches to correcting your data. So, and you can rank up your A's, B's, C's. And I'm going to see, did that survey come up? Oh, good. Oh, good. That's part of the thrill of in-work stuff. So everyone can give their answers. And how do I review the answers?
Once people, you can click on survey statistics, you have to wait till people.
Ah.
Okay, so if someone has already, yeah, so you can, do you see this showing up?
Oh, it's down at the bottom?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And then you can click on like choice 1, choice 2, choice, you can see how many
Okay.
people, so it tells you how many people picked each one.
Oh,
Isn't that cool?
very nice.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Look at that, 6 respondents ready. This is so exciting. Technology is fun. So as people are getting in here, the most stringent one is the Bonferroni correction. And then the FDR, and then the random field will come up next. So basically, with imaging, doing Bonferroni correction is really will kill your chance of finding things, which will also kill your chance of being funded. So consider that before you go with the Bonferroni approach. Okay, so with all these things in light, people went, clustering, great. There's a warm, happy place for the future of imaging. And with the clustering, it was that sort of approach where you adjust your voxel-based p-value and you adjust your cluster-level p-value. There is a lot of wiggle room. And as you can see by a chart here, we've got smooth data, and you adjust your cluster size, and you adjust your p-value, and you can wiggle things around. And there's a number of significant results that you can end up with picking. And often what happens if you give people a number of choices, people pick a number of different options. So a lot of people did like the cluster approach. As you can see, 75% of the data up until 2014 was using that cluster approach. But what people determine is a good voxel level p-value was really variable according to what package they used, how they felt that morning, what turned out significant. No, I'm not saying people did that, but it did raise a concern. So there was a paper out in 2014 which said, okay, if you're going to pick a p-threshold and if you're going to set, say, your voxel level at 0.05 and look for a really huge cluster that only comes up that size 1 in 20 times, then you're going to get these large blobs. You're going to get lots of false positives. You won't be able to localize things, and you won't be able to interpret the findings very easily. And so they pushed for moving up that voxel-based p-value to a higher number, to at least, 0.005, maybe a 0.001, so that you're reducing that chance of false positives and you're localizing your areas better. So, and there was also the observation, and this is just sort of a cute example of how even if you do some level of voxel correction, or if you do, this was the scanning of a salmon, Atlantic mature salmon, 18 inches long, in the scan, and they were doing a mentalization task. And a significant cluster was found in this data, which I saw this paper back when it came out, and then looking through it later was kind of hard to find because apparently it didn't really publish. It's mostly sarcasm, but it caught a lot of press, and it effectively makes a point that sometimes your data can be a red herring or a Atlantic salmon or whatever. It can be fishy is the main point. So then everybody was kind of nervous, but continued on, plowing the course until about 2015, when the availability of mass amounts of data and mass amounts of software and more computer power led to people going, okay, what if we did a task, put on task regressors on top of resting state data? Two things should not relate. That we should not get significant clusters at above about 1 in 20. Our odds should be about that rate if we're doing everything right. And here's an example on the, I'm dyslexic and it really depends on which way I'm facing. I'm going to say the left side. The voxel level was sent at that 0.01 level, and then it was corrected, and different smoothing was used, and it was run through different packages, and lo and behold, this resting state data was getting significant results at above the 0.05 level. In fact, in some ways, you can say that 40% of the time you could have published this resting state data, but or gotten a false positive. Depends on which way you're looking at it, glass half empty, glass half full. So one easy way of helping out your data a lot is setting that p-value a lot higher. So setting it to p.001, you can clean up that data, and that's what's displayed there on the right. It's also hard to see, but right down here, you can see a line which actually overlaps with the expected range. That's permutations, and we'll get back to that in a little bit, how permutations can actually be your friend. So, not that I sort of gave you much warning on this one, but it's good to think about what are false positives and false negatives when we talk about them, and this gave me another opportunity to use a little quiz function. So, go ahead and let me know what you think the alignment of these things are. What do you do while people are doing the quizzes? Oh.
You can moderate the survey. You can sort of see if people are logging in.
Okay.
Look at the survey statistics.
Okay, I'll just refresh until,
Yeah.
we're getting stuff.
Yeah, and then you see what you need to talk about.
See if that made any sense. Oh, look at that. So, it seems like we have general agreement, which is good, that, okay, so, it's weird, it came up with those inverse. Okay, so yes, the true positives in A is what you want ideally, and the false positives, which are in C, are always a little bit of a downer. So people are getting what's what and what we're talking about when we're talking about those things. So I'll move on. So sort of thinking about your underlying data here is this is that you have what we talked about. We have correlation in your noise, but you also have correlation in the underlying structure of your data, and you have other correlations in your functioning of your data, and the combination of these things can make some areas more susceptible to getting false positives. So a example of a standard least squares is on your left. I'm getting better at sort of its laterality things, that's good. And you can see there's an increase in the default mode network area, which is super encouraging because that's exactly where, you know, a lot of the data comes out and is published, is this area that has a high rate of false positives. So that's comforting. You can control for that more with permutations, but you can still see that's an area of concern. So not all areas are successfully controlled in an equal way. You need to be cognizant of it. And when you talk about a lot of these corrections, they don't take in the specific region and the aspects of region into account as well as they should. So one of the main concerns about this is when you do the random field theory or you do any of this data, you blur your data. And this can be very helpful in controlling for adjacent noise at a scale and giving you a clearer picture of what your underlying data is and giving you something to pull out. But the Gaussian blur that you hope exists in your data won't truly exist because of the properties of noise and the properties of function and the underlying structure and all these things mean that the Gaussian that people thought that they were blurring with didn't account for the inherent blur in the data. And the Gaussian that the people thought they were blurring by didn't mean that your end state signal, your end state smoothness was Gaussian. So all of the assumptions that were made on the data, assuming that noise was distributed in a Gaussian manner, was incorrect. And what you needed to do was here, this would be a Gaussian curve, and this is a Gaussian curve aimed to cross over at sort of a full width half maximum, which is the parameter that the Gaussian data uses as its parameter of shifting the model. It's 1 to 0 with a full width half maximum, and that's a one parameter model. But you can see underlying this is a black line that doesn't really fit that Gaussian curve very well. As it goes out, it has that extended tail. And so what AFNI developed in sort of a response to mismatching this was an autocorrelation function or a 3-parameter model. We talked about that briefly, that can map the red line better onto the black. So now when you recreate your noise data, you aim to have noise that follows that more realistic blurring function that allows for longer tails in your data and allows for more distal data influencing the noise in your data and inflating the autocorrelations that way. So inflating the false positives. So after being sort of knocked back a little bit with that obvious problem that with a p.05 or 0.01 giving you a really high level of false positives, the Anthony looked at doing the same thing in a similar model in a few other approaches. They tended to find that above 0.01, nothing much helped you not get high levels of false positives. But the autocorrelation was helping at various levels of blur as that p-value dropped down. So in general, p-values above 0.005 are, even though this suggests it, I would say that in general, you want to stay below the 0.05, specifically 0.001 at the voxel level is where you would want to be with your data. And then you can set your cluster level at 0.05. That's fine. But it's really the false positives that you acquire by having a low voxel level, not setting your P at the voxel level down to a significantly low model. So, and as you slip down that curve of your alpha, your voxel level and your cluster level, you're required smaller and smaller voxels of clusters. So this is, again, going back to that Wu paper, this means that you have more localized signal. It's still significant, but it changes the way that the brain imaging that you publish and you come out with and you see looks. Instead of getting these large swaths of a brain and big colors, you get little ones. Yeah?
Can you just recap what the axes are on the plot?
Oh, sure. Across this, within many, many numbers, was the voxel-based threshold. Here is the cluster-based threshold. And in this representative data, this is the size of cluster on the Y, or Z, or I don't know, the up-down. And you can see that you get a rapid drop-off as that p-value changes. And that's once you get a more controlled p-value range, then you have sort of a consistent level of where you expect those clusters to come out with. And you get a more localized, usually a lot smaller, often in the range of like, I'm going to say 5 to 20 voxels in your cluster. If it's, or it depends on the size of your cluster, your resampling and such like. Okay. So, question number 3. And I will make this available to you guys in short order once I figure out how to work my phone. So, this next one wanted to talk about why we're concerned with blurring. So, what things are the major influences that blurring has on your data? Yeah, that's totally.
So I still am very confused by Anthony's, the previous slide, where if you increase the cluster, decrease the cluster p-value. Anyways, your threshold becomes smaller cluster size as you get more strict.
Yeah.
But that's a threshold, right, for the cluster?
Yeah.
So it still makes sense to me why you would have smaller cluster size as your threshold as you get more stringent on that.
Well, if you have if you say you would only need, say, one significant voxel, that occurs all the time. But as you require more and more voxels bundled together, then that's occurring less. So that's matching to alpha. If you adjust, like with this one, we expected this is how many voxels are significant when you set the voxel level at 0.01 or 0.01. If you set this to 0.0000001, this table would shrink up to the top, right? That'd only be a couple times that you're getting more than 1 or 2 voxels contiguous.
Right.
So that's what you're seeing the effect of here, is as the noise is showing less, as your p-value gets really tiny, your noise is never going to get clusters that are 300 voxels in size. So your threshold of what would count as significant on that Monte Carlo drops down as it gets harder for your noise data to achieve those levels.
Okay, so you're like given more liberty almost with
Yeah.
cluster size when your when your voxel peak gets
Exactly.
really low. Okay, that makes sense.
Cool.
Thank you.
Sure. No problem. So, let's see. Yes, yes, totally. So I'm going to flip through and see which ones. Okay. So major concerns with blur. Yes, the size of the area is a concern. I think everyone got that. Accurate measurement. So actually, effects on time series. Let's go to that one first. Your spatial blurring isn't really going to affect your time series. So that's not something you need to worry about in that regard. Signal outside of a brain? Not really. You mask your data. Signal outside your brain is going to be accounted for there. You can have you won't get too much false signal intruding from outside the brain into your imaging data unless you left your pager in there or something like that.
And it
It's
wouldn't be locked to the stimulus, right?
yeah.
So then it would probably average out.
Yeah. You can have distortions and concerns like that potentially with sinuses and blah blah blah. What I was really picking up in one of the main things is inaccurate measurement, and probably the reason why this one was confusing is inaccurate measurement is such a global, vast term that it could mean anything. You're going to get false positives with if you're not paying attention to the effects of your blur and what your blur is in your actual data, then you're going to assume a characteristic of your noise, assume a characteristic of your blur, and you're not going to effectively threshold your data in light of what the actual inherent noise of your data is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, that goes back to, and I'm not sure, do you know a more eloquent way of describing things? But that goes back to the inherent noise of your data bubbling up and giving you false positives.
I'm not sure what you mean by inaccurate measurement.
Yeah, I realize now that I think that confused people that term inaccurate measurement. And I think that's an inaccurate term. And I think that's probably what happened there. But so more it was sort of a refresh on circling back on this content. I'll fix that for futures. But it was a question of creation of false positives, inaccurately assessing if you had true pulse signal.
So
Why
I
would
guess the thing
blurring
is,
create?
if you blur and you're including like noisy voxels that have non-random noise, then you would have an effect on the time series, which could be, like if you had motion artifacts that were accentuated at an edge or, physiological noise, then you could actually add in
Do you mean by blurring adjacent regions that
Yeah.
are more susceptible to physiological? Yeah, that's why I sort of put the major concern. I don't think
Yeah.
that's largely those time series things you're going to take care of through, aroma or fix or time series level data. It can affect things, but I don't think that's not the main concern.
So you're saying inaccurate measurement, you're saying that the blur, because you're not accurately accounting for the autocorrelation, or?
Right, is more that more by inaccurate measurement, creating more false positives. in your data. So the blur, not properly accounting for your blur.
Okay, so it's not it's more you haven't estimated the blur
Yeah.
correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other effect, obviously, that you get into that is the fact that even these methods, and AFNI doesn't, I'm not sure if it has it in yet, but the fact that the blur varies spatially, right? So
Yeah.
a lot of these algorithms assume one blur, but as you see, for the phosphorescent cortex, the blur is very different there than in the rest of the brain. So if you apply the same full half maximum, you're going to be wrong in certain brain regions,
Right.
which is
You inflate your chance of finding things in the PCC.
right. And because behind all these blurs, basically the resting state activity is what's creating these correlations, right? So the more resting state activity somebody has, the more these effects become important. So there can actually even be a trait effect where you might have a group that has, let's say one of your groups that just has more resting state activity than the other group, then you could potentially have a systematic error in one group that's different from another group. So it's something to be aware of.
Cheers. So, one thing that can be very helpful in this regard is to permute your data. And FSL was ahead of the curve in dealing with this. They've got randomize and Palm. Palm's is sort of a more in-depth form of testing permutations, and it can actually be used on non-imaging data in sort of looking at dense permutations. And there's a nice paper where they even do permutations on the HCP data with different forms of monozygotic, dizygotic, twin family sets. And you can do nested permutations. And a simple permutation can be something where you're just doing simple sign flipping. So you've got, say, two groups and you change those groups. So you make people who are group A into group B some of the times and vice versa. And then you run your statistic again. And you keep running them through the different kinds of permutations of your group numbers. And you keep testing them until, okay, did you get, so that's switching which sample you're in. If you switch which group you're in and you test again, switch which group you're in, test again, you get a measurement of a p-value each time. And you can plot out basically a histogram of those p-values and mark that. If you're doing the sign flipping, that's more that you have a value in your data, your BDI score or what have you, and you center it, you sign flip it, and you keep doing these sign flips, see if you're moving your data that way. And there's different ways of doing the permutations depending on which question you're running into. When you start getting into more complex analysis, there are more and more different ways in which you can achieve all your permutations. So you want to be, yeah. So permutations can allow you to get that histogram of your p-values, and then you can mark based on reorganizing your data how often you're going to get a significant value, rather than just going, it's a p.05. It'll just work that way. This is actually testing it in your raw data to make sure that randomness, random group reassignment, random value reassignment, that you're outperforming that. This can be especially helpful, just to sort of do this can be especially helpful if you have more advanced algorithms that have a high level of fit. Like if you have a multivariate analysis, that it's trying to get the highest linear fit, and it will achieve a high linear fit that isn't zero. If you do a multiple regression, you can get things that are, machine learning. You can get things that you will always get some level of fit in some data, and then permutations can really help you work out what in your data what is true significance. Another nice feature.
Just a couple.
Yeah,
One
absolutely.
thing is that permutation analysis, you have to, it's not really that useful for like pilot testing because, let's say you only have 5 subjects and you want to do a 1 sample t-test and you only have 2 to the 5 permutations, so that's only 32 combinations. So to look at any, so that's like 0.03 is the best you can, it's the most you can test. So it's not really that useful if you're just trying to pilot something. You really need like 10 or 15 or 20 subjects to be able to use permutation testing. But as Alan was saying, it is really useful because all the traditional models are based on theoretical models of Gaussians and really modeling things very well. This is more in the line of what's called bootstrapping or resampling methods, which is basically you're creating what's called the empirical null distribution. You're figuring out the statistics from the data, and that is why it just works much better and it's really only in the last, say, decade or so, right, that the computers have been powerful enough to do this. So in the old days, you would spend a lot of time studying statistics and looking at things. Nowadays, you just let the computer figure it out. So that's just sort of general context of why, not only in neuroimaging, but everywhere the field is moving towards more just what's called non-parametric testing or resampling or bootstrap.
Mm-hmm. So FSL for the longest time was the only one that was really engaging in some level of permutations testing. What they also came up with, which is a nice, very nice feature, is threshold-free clustering enhancement. And the idea here being that when you set a hard threshold of what you consider significance at a line value across your data, you can get little spikes in your data that you can believe will be significant or not, and you cluster those together and where they touch. But there's a lot of noise on top of your data, and you won't be reading that situation exactly right. What they did is they applied you can see it as getting a smoothed out value that takes into account the adjacency of neighboring values. So you can see here is a nice example. They have an original signal. If it's a singular spike, there's no other supporting data, then that singular spike represents that piece of data. But if you get something that has a broader base, that it has more supporting data, that supporting data can encourage you that there's a true p-value in there, and so you get an enhancement. Similarly, here, you get enhanced data when you have more supporting information. So through that, you can get a more complex signal, like up here above, and you can work out what actually looks like supportable p-values. The adjacent areas are supporting that value. So what it turns out to be is, here's the equation of how they're building it, but your height is dependent upon the width of your data at various cut points, so that you can have your data reflect actually how much supportive or the total mass of your data. And loosely said, you can think of it like a lot of the concern of this is icebergs of your data. An iceberg can of the same weight can have a large spike out of the water, or it can have a large broad area out of the water, but both of those icebergs have similar buoyancies, similar amount of impact. You run your ship into it, will cause similar damage. So it's significant iceberg is what I'm saying. So what you want to do is, this gives a nice way of seeing how much signal around is supporting the fact that this is a significant iceberg. Again, a Titanic analogy. So similar to the time that randomize in FSL brought up permutations and made it commonplace, that was also available in SBM. And this one was nice in that this gives a nice visualization of what Tom and I were talking about with that histogram. This t-value distribution actually did show something that wasn't zero. So thinking that you could beat zero and that was a good thing means that noise data, fake data, resorting your data in any kind of situation was giving a t of around 4. But here, at 0.05% of the time, you could actually see that distribution of data coming off. So that gave you better than that permuted way can give you a more accurate estimate. And this is a nice way of looking at it. This didn't catch on as much as randomize, and randomize really led a lot of the way and in how to deal with those permutations questions. So this is a sort of a odd one to see how well I described some form of the permutations, and also just a thought experiment, if nothing else, into what you get when you permute your data in different ways, and how that will affect your understanding of the data. So here we have a resorting of the data, and so you have two different groups, Group A and Group B, and you've now reordered the data in this way, and then you also have your selfie count, and you reorder the data this way. So if you reordered the data, so 1, 2, 3, 4, it's lining up like this, would that be a plausible permutation for your t-test, your between group t-test, versus if you permuted it in this new order, would that be a plausible permutation for your correlation? Does that make sense as a question first?
Wait, so new order is the subject label?
New order is if you were to, right now they're in their initial order. When you permute, you can put in a new order, a new shuffling of your data, and then you order them along those lines.
So that just applies to the left part.
Yeah,
To the left of the order.
it moves your subject data around, but your groups will stay the same in this count.
What are you correlating?
Correlating here, you're looking at your selfie count versus your imaging data. So you're either looking at your group versus your data, or you're looking at selfie count versus your data, where your imaging data is moving along with your order. So, for example, if we're talking about the group analysis, that would be subject 4 moving up to the first plot, subject 2 staying right where it is, subject 5 moving up to a third spot, etc. And if you were doing it with the correlations, that again is this subject 4 going up to that first spot with the imaging data, with the selfie count staying in the same position. So I know a sort of old question, I didn't really give you sort of full background, but this is sort of underneath the hood. Does it make sense how permutations are behaving?
You want us to just write it into your app?
Hmm?
Oh, that's what I did.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, write it into your app.
cool. Yeah, I'm still experimenting on how this puppy works. So if the quiz doesn't actually make much sense, then do your best, and I will learn. Okay, so we're around 8 or 9, eight respondents in so far. So, being chronically impatient and such.
I got to 13.
Ah, okay,
Nice.
nice.
Refresh.
Okay, that's good. There's a benefit of being slightly more patient. So, if you reorder these according to this new order, and you move the imaging data accordingly and kept the selfie the same way, that's helpful for the correlation, because now you've you've moved things around in a random order that the assignments on that correlation value have moved for individuals. It's not the perfect one, but it's plausible. When it comes to the group data, we've moved people around within group. We haven't moved people across group. So this wouldn't be a helpful permutations test for that group test. So when you want to test across group, you'd want some of the 1 through 5s being sorted into that group B, some of the 6s through 10s being in that group A. So they need to switch across groups. With the correlation, that number was random, not related to group. So it doesn't necessarily need to switch across group. If you know the group exists, you can do nested permutations, but that's what you're enacting in the permutations. Okay. Does that make sense to people, conceptually? Okay. That was the end of me testing out the quizzing for today. But you still should pay attention because you want to learn things. So, 3D t-test plus plus is something Lisa brought up when she was talking about the test. It is, of all the group testing methods that AFNI has, it is the one most supported, the one which they've put the most bells and whistles into. And it's the only one that really takes on this permutations. Well, it's the only one that takes on the permutations issue. So it can do it, but it does the permutations just at the very sort of simple group level way. It does a sign flipping of the data for a one sample t-test, and thus it can do some group reshuffling for the 2 sample. It doesn't really get into the layered or the nested permutations that you can do within Palm, or get into applying permutations to a more complex set of analysis that you would want to do with an LME or the MVM that she talked about earlier. So it has the ClusSim feature, which here we talked about the autocorrelation function earlier, that we were looking at noise in our data. Where you acquire that noise in your data when you're just going through your data analysis is through the error time series. There you get that outputted of a deconvolve. You can measure your blur that way and measure sort of what your inherent blur in your data is with a 3-parameter fit. Another way in which you can find noise in your data or where your blur in your data is at this t-test level. You run these permutations, you run your analysis, you save out the errors, and then you can actually use that residual as well to look at the inherent blur in your data and how much that's explaining things in your data. And that's what you can do as you run through the permutations. You can use those residuals to start mapping out the blur in your group level data. So that's what's going on in the back of 3D t-test plus. So when you're doing your calculation of your correlation, or using 3D ClusSim in your data, when you're dealing with LME and MVN, you want to be using the subject level, and you can find that subject level blur by getting the measurement of the blur using 3D full width half maximum X, which will give you a 3-parameter model. Now, you may wonder, why do they still continue to call it 3D full width half maximum, which is the 1 parameter of a Gaussian model, if it no longer reports back the 1 parameter of a Gaussian model, and it instead gives you the 3 parameters of the ACF fit? I don't have an answer for that. I also don't know what the X is doing there. But it works to do the thing that you want it to do. But they also went a little bit further and did a very nice feature called ETAC. Nice feature, maybe not the best acronym, but it's equitable threshold and clustering is what it's called. And the goal of this is to address some of that concern that we talked about with multiple p-values at the voxel level and multiple values of your cluster level. And as you require a more stringent voxel level p-value, your requirements for your cluster size are going to go down. And as you make that less stringent, you allow your p-value approaches 0.01, that cluster size requirement is going to go up. And where you select is somewhat arbitrary. You could just decide a priori 0.001, 0.05, but that might not be the perfect one. It might not be the perfect one considering the different levels of blur in your data. And what ETAC does for you here is it allows you to sample a number of different threshold points. So they give the example of 4 hypothetical clusters. And here, at the standard threshold, only J would show up because you would set the arbitrary, and this could be, you set the arbitrary 0.001 and the arbitrary 12 clusters. And as you shift and you sample different areas of, of this curve, then there's more significant regions that you can find that would still count as significant. And here they give an example where they've now tested 4 different points. They've created their threshold cutoff lines. And then with the allowance that you can't really test them all without changing it, sort of Schrodinger's cat sort of experience, that you're overinflating it unless you shift that value a little bit. So they mathematically adjust what that shift would be. So this is another method of sort of trying to find a good way of testing what would be true significance in your data and giving you a larger, broader approach to it. Any questions? Any questions on that? Okay. Then I'm going to move on to general ethical considerations. Oh, yeah.
So what do you think we should be doing?
What do I think we should be doing? I think we should be doing permutations testing is the best approach. I think that if you're working with tools that don't allow for that level of permutations testing, then you can sort of get away with setting a very high p-value to reduce your false positives. So setting it at, and if you're doing permutations, setting a high p-value also doesn't hurt you. So I'd say set your voxel level p-value at 0.001. Your cluster level is fine at 0.05, and permutations if it's available in the analysis that you're doing. What would you be your?
Would you recommend using ETAC, or is that too late?
I've played around with ETAC, and I think ETAC seems a rational way to go about it. It is less stringent than FDR or something like that, and but it's going to be more stringent than a 3D cluster sim on your individual level as tested in the LME. So it's going to be in that mid-region. And when I say liberal, how often you get activations. So I would say that if you're using 3D t-tests, if you're working with Afni and you can do a t-test, then doing it with ETAC is rational and reasonable. I tend to model things with a little bit denser, so in LME. So there, setting my p-value at 0.001 is sort of a solution so I can feel okay about my data and, sleep at night.
But I guess the question for the community is sort of, I mean, so like some people, you could either set a very stringent per voxel threshold of
Mhm.
point, is it 0.01 or 0.001?
001, yeah.
0.001, so it's
Yeah.
very stringent, right? So a lot of people, they do that on their data, they'll have 0 results, right? So then they'll try permutation, and they'll
Mhm.
see if that gives you any results. And then they'll try ETAC, and basically there's multiple comparisons of finding
Which comparison is, yes, which handles your multi-comparisons
which
best?
is going to give you your result.
Yes.
So is that just what we're going to assume everyone's going to do? Or?
I'd say that's a relatively fair assumption. I mean, just sort of being snarky, but I think for me, I tend to fall there. Most of everything I'm doing it at the 0.001, 0.05 with an LME approach.
So using R or using?
Often using R. Often I sort of write all my own sort of back-end scripts because I get a kick out of it. But still, those levels of thresholding and going based off of the seeming noise in your data. I think the long-term, I think shifting to permutations is sort of while still allowing me to have all the different statistical tests I want, is where I'll be going. So if I have, if doing canonical correlations or sort of advanced multivariate ones, I do permutations outside after I've sort of picked my ROIs a priori, and then I permute my data and see if I've actually got significance there. So that's sort of a mixed match of fitting, pushing the permutations as much as I can as my data allows. Yeah.
This is all seems to be considering p-values. What about effect sizes as your dependent variable?
Right, and that's, I don't know if Atom doesn't take that into consideration or make it easy to produce effect size match. Post hoc, yeah, from a t-stat.
From z, t, or
Right.
values.
Yeah, it's a little harder going from LMEs, right? Because there's no direct translation, so you have to sort of hackney it a little bit. But yeah, generally, I think having an effect size map and showing that is a very nice response to all the concerns with this magic p.05 level concern. And I think, I know Lisa on her day, she was talking about the benefits of those effect size maps. The nice thing about that is that then you're showing all the data, and you can show the overall effect size maps, show all the data, and you can let people determine, for themselves that you're being honest and transparent. So yeah, I agree that is also a very good way of addressing this, with maximal transparency. Okay. Is that what you do with your?
Well, I have to start doing it with some of the ABCD data.
Yeah.
10,000 people, everything's significant. Yeah, effect sizes are the only way to know at all what may be meaningful.
Right. Yeah.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah.
I noticed that you don't use FSL much.
No, I don't, which is a personal failing and something which I'm working on. Largely, sort of at San Diego, it's been a AFNI community, and FSL has a lot of features that are further along in that path. And I know when you talk about like ABCD or HCP or things like that, there's FreeSurfer and there's FSL are heavily used there.
Would you ever recommend just kind of going into randomize, and it's
Yeah.
flame does a little bit better.
Flame may overcorrect a little bit on those, but yeah, it's. I think that if you woke up this morning and in native space, is it FSL that you would go to, or would you then go to dealing with anatomical instead because it's slightly less painful, or just counseling, you know?
It seems to be one of those things where caffeine is better for some stuff, especially the multiple regression things. You can capture more anatomy than you can with FSL. But if you're doing ICA analysis,
Yeah.
you're in FSL.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, no, that's the point. I guess that's one of the reasons why I with randomized, there's some analysis I want to do which I can't do, and I end up doing things in R or in another package where I have a lot more flexibility in what I'm working with. But yeah, I'd say being multilingual is the biggest win. Sort of very non-answer answer. There you go. Okay, so this sort of, you know, this sort of brings about the question of both when the clustering thing came up and also when you're thinking about representing your data, what kind of things do you need to be cognizant of? Really, the computational power available now allows you to test permutations, but it also will allow you to the availability of cloud data and availability to share your data, share your code, will make sure that data is more you can do more reproducible work. What things you because really having reproducible data is the goal, and then you have concerns about let's see, you have concerns about what you do on your own personal ethics, because there is 1,000 different things you can do, and as Tom alluded to, you know, okay, after you test it with randomize, and you test it with E-Tech, and then you test it with T-Test, which one really looked the best? And no one's going to be over your shoulder making those decisions for you. So you want to be cognizant of what you're doing and making sure that you're not doing it. And then, yeah, when you review papers, you know, how much light are you going to shine on these? How much you're going to question these effects? And in the end, a lot of this comes down to level of credibility. If imaging engages in behaviors that are below sort of standard data science practices, it's going to hurt the image of imaging. Yeah, okay, I'll stick with that. So this Eklund paper did sort of say there was 15 years of data or 40,000 papers, but really, should we retract them all and say, oops, you know, and that doesn't help the credibility of science. And they actually backed off of that stance a little bit and said, okay, we're not saying all of the 15 years were bad. You know, there were a couple good years. So data sharing will help with this, making data that you're working on publicly available. And a lot of the larger projects, ACP and ABCD, those are off of data resources that are broadly available, and that's helpful. They are producing data pipelines, both for the acquisition and for the production of that data, and that can be helpful. And then a question is, in clinical trials, they register their outcomes and they register their hypothesis ahead of time. In imaging, we tend not to. There's 1,000 different paths that your data could take. Sometimes, for rational reasons, you don't know your exact pipeline. You don't know maybe you got some noise in your scanner and you're going to need to bandwidth filter this one, or you're going to need to do a ICA and you hadn't thought about that. Or imaging will change over the next couple months and a new, better pathway avails itself and you want to move forward with that. But to what degree do we need an outside influence setting our goalposts and our milestones versus do you need to be cognizant of it as you go along with your own data and make sure that you are staying true to the story and idea that you had? Because in it, sort of the denominator of that Bonferroni is how many different ideas you have about your data. And that can raise some real questions about, are you going to get a reproducible thing in the end? And sometimes some of the largest luxuries I've had is I've run a task in like 4 different distal populations. And when, the insula came up with pain in 4 different groups, then I both learned that I'm mean and I keep torturing people with heat pain, and that maybe it does relate to the insula. So, there's a reproducibility of your data is in the end a very important and your end state goal of any of this data analysis. So with that, there's some articles of interest if people want to do some more reading. I've put the Brett paper on random field theory in there because it also has a nice introduction about Bonferroni, FDR, and spatial blurring, and all the things that I ran through too quick for really getting to the depths of. They do a nice job of walking through. But up top, if you want to hear about how terrible imaging was for 15 years, there's the click to the Eklund, and then there's various people responding to, okay, where, what can we do about that, and what concerns we have. So with that, any questions? Okay. Well, that's basically all I had for today. Anything you guys want to add?
So will there be a practical this Friday?
Yes. Yeah. Lisa is totally on top of it, and she sent me something, and I'm supposed to add like 3 lines to it, which I should do a little bit later today.
Okay, so just so everyone
Yeah.
knows, they'll be posted hopefully later today.
Yeah.
Frank will be starting on Wednesday to talk about functional connectivity. And if I get back together, I'll try to have the final project. We'll either announce it this Wednesday or next Wednesday. Or if I start thinking about